Hey, I'm Daniel and welcome back to another Elder Scrolls Betrayal of the Second Era video. And today we're doing a skill line breakdown. I'll explain how it works, highlight some common rules mistakes, and share some tips based on official clarification, community knowledge and my own playtime. Let's go! Alright, so let's talk about the bow skill line. And as you can tell by this little icon at the bottom of the reference sheet, this skill line belongs to the warrior constellation, which is important for certain abilities or encounter rules that specifically refer to this and warrior constellation icon. This skill line is also associated with stamina as the main stat, which means the number of dice you can roll in a single engage is limited by the number of stamina you trained on your character, and all dice from this skill line require ranged battle form as indicated by these icons over here. So let's talk about this ranged battle form first. As a feature of this skill line, you can target enemies in range up to your stamina stat. So let's say in this case we have stamina 3, so we can target enemies up to 3 hexes away from us, which in this case, if this is our adventure, 1, 2, 3, we can target Breton Bandit. But at the same time, also as a limitation of this battle form, we cannot target adjacent enemies. So let's say if this Breton Bandit would be adjacent, we wouldn't be able to target it. And also keep in mind that the enemies that you are targeting in range, they also have to be in sight, which is something that is pretty commonly overlooked. And being in sight is pretty simple. It's basically all units that are on the same tile or an adjacent tile. So in this particular case, because we're standing on the same tile, we have sight to each other. And let's say if we add another tile, something like that, and I mean enemy would be standing here, we're still in sight because it's an adjacent tile. But if we add another tile, maybe something like that, and let's say we place this Breton Bandit just 1 hex further away, it's still technically in range because we're still 1, 2, 3 hexes away from us, but it is no longer on the adjacent tile, so this enemy is no longer in sight. And that means that the only valid hex that we can target this enemy from would be this one, because if we stand here, that means this tile is now adjacent to our tile, so we have sight, and we still have range, so we're not adjacent, so we're not standing here, for example, from this or this hex, we wouldn't be able to target this Breton Bandit, and at the same time we can't target it from here either, because this is not an adjacent tile. So yeah, the only hex we would be able to target this Breton Bandit is this one. As I said, it's pretty basic, fundamental rule, but at the same time I find so many people overlooking this, so I thought I should mention this. Now, as for targeting adjacent enemies, as I already mentioned, this is the limitation of the ranged battle form, that you cannot target adjacent enemies. However, there is only one exception to the game, at least presently in the game, there is a single item, this particular bow called Rescuer Bow, that says you may target adjacent enemies. So if we happen to have this item, we can indeed just stand adjacent to this enemy and still target it even in ranged battle form. But other than that, if we don't have this bow, we normally can't do that. Now let's take a look at the level 1 skill dice from the bow skill line called Snipe. It says deal X damage to your target, ignore 1 defense on your target for this engage. And if you look at all the faces of the die, it's basically exactly the same as the basic combat dice. It has 4 sides of 1 damage, it has 1 side of 2 damage, and it has 1 side of miss. So it's pretty much the same damage-wise, but with the only and pretty important distinction that it ignores 1 defense on your target for this engage. So let's see how that works. So first, let's say we roll just 1 combat die, and this is the result. We deal 1 damage to this Breton Bandit, but because it has 1 defense, this enemy takes no damage. Now if we roll 1 snipe dice instead, we deal the same, just a single 1 damage, but because this die ignores 1 defense, we're essentially treating this enemy as having just no defense, and that means that Breton Bandit would take 1 damage. And the best part of this dice is that the ignoring effect is stacks from multiple dice rolled in a single engage. So just for demonstration purposes, instead of Breton Bandit, let's put this Orc Marauder instead, which has 2 defense, and let's say we rolled 2 snipe dice with this result. And so while this enemy has 2 defense, because each of the snipe dice they ignore 1 defense, we're essentially kind of subtracting 1 defense value for each snipe dice rolled. So that essentially becomes 2 defense minus 2 defense. We're essentially treating this enemy as having no defense, and therefore it will take 2 damage from this particular engage. But now let's say we rolled one of those dice on the miss side. How much damage Orc Marauder would take in this case? And the answer is pretty simple. In this case, Orc Marauder would take no damage, simply because in order to get the ignoring defense effect, you need to roll actually this result with the arrow, regardless of the number, whether it's 1 or 2. it's regardless of the damage dealing, it still ignores only 1 defense, but you need to roll this arrow symbol. So in this case, 2 defense minus 1 ignoring defense, that would be still 1 defense left, which wouldn't be enough to go through. But if we add another basic combat die to this engage, that would be 2 damage with 1 ignoring defense effect, and in this case this would be enough to go through this Orc Marauder's defense, and therefore it will lose 1 health. And remember, because there are 4 of those snipe dice in total, and because they're ignoring defense effect stack, that means you can potentially ignore up to 4 defense on your target. However, generally speaking, as a little pro tip, I would advise rolling that number of snipe dice. That would be the minimum number needed in order to go through enemy's defense. And let me explain what I mean by that. Let's say instead of this Orc Marauder we have this Breton Bandit back again here, and let's say we have all those dice back ready for rolling. And so let's say as a first to engage you roll this only snipe dice and you roll this 2 damage result, which means Breton Bandit would take 2 damage, and this dice would go to the cooldown track. Then you might want to take a second engage, add in light fatigue according to the difficulty settings, and then let's say you roll this basic combat dice with the same result, dealing just 2 damage. But because this enemy has 1 defense, means that it will prevent 1 damage, so only 1 damage would go through, and that means that even after 2 engages this enemy will still be alive. But now let's roll this back for a moment. Let's say it has back to full health, and we have all our dice available for rolling again. And so instead of rolling 2 snipe dice, we could instead roll 1 snipe die and 1 basic combat die. That would be 2 damage with 1 ignoring defense, so this enemy would lose 2 health. This die will go to the cooldown track, then we're taking another engage, rolling the same dice, and let's say with the same result, that is another 2 damage, and this time this would be enough to defeat this enemy. And so as you can tell, just by rolling the same 4 dice but just in a different combination, this can be resulted in a completely different outcome. And also of course make sure to put the snipe dice first in your cooldown track, because remember that you can choose the order you resolve this dice, so you could potentially put this way, but that also would mean that you would recover this combat dice first. So again, just make sure you put the snipe dice first if you roll these 2 together. Moving on to the level 2, let's talk about the Volley die, which says deal a total of 4 damage distributed as you choose among enemies adjacent to you. Then place yourself in an unoccupied hex 2 to 4 hexes away from your current hex. And there is a lot to unpack here. First of all, this die can deal damage to adjacent enemies. And if you remember, the limitation of our ranged battle form is the fact that we cannot target adjacent enemies, but the caveat in this particular die that it doesn't say anything about the target. And that means that we can roll Volley die alongside some other dice in a single engage, targeting other enemies while still dealing damage to enemies adjacent who are not our targets. So let's say we declare Breton Bandit as our target and we roll these 2 dice against it, so 1 snipe die and 1 volley. So in this particular case we would deal 1 damage to Breton Bandit with snipe dice, because remember that snipe they ignore 1 defense, so the 1 damage would go through Breton Bandits, and with Volley die we can choose to distribute 4 damage among adjacent enemies as we choose. For example, we can choose to deal 1 damage to this spider because it's stalwart, it can't lose more than 1 health in a turn anyway, and the rest 3 damage to this Orc Marauder, even though it has 2 defense, which means only 1 damage would go through, because remember that snipe ignores defense only on your target, and in this case our target is on the Breton Bandit. And after dealing damage with Volley, we can also place ourselves 2 to 4 hexes away from our current hex, and keep in mind that the word place is different from move, so all abilities that affects movement they don't apply here, but we can essentially jump or teleport even through units, so moving 2 hexes we can just potentially move on this hex, even though that wouldn't make much sense, but just for illustration purposes that would be placing ourselves 2 hexes from where we're currently standing. And also keep in mind that because dealing damage is not necessarily considered an engage, this can be potentially a little walk around certain enemies. For example, if we instead of this Orc Marauder we would have Red God Marauder, which has Shatter, and as you can probably know, Shatter means that if you engage this enemy you would need to either overtax your weapon or discard another weapon, but with the Volley die we can deal damage and potentially defeat this enemy without even engaging it, and therefore without triggering its Shatter ability. And also keep in mind that despite the fact that we can choose the order we resolve our die, and let's say if we roll this die and you might think that you could deal damage first with this Volley die, then jump away from those enemies, and then maybe use your snipe die to deal damage to some of those enemies, but unfortunately that's not gonna work. And that is simply because you need to declare a target before you roll it and resolving the die. So while you were standing, let's say, adjacent to this enemy, those both 2 units, they are not valid units for targeting, because you can target with this in the ranged battle form only enemies that are not adjacent. So while you can roll Volley and snipe dice, let's say targeting Breton Bandit, dealing damage with snipe dice to this unit and dealing damage to adjacent unit with Volley, that can work. unfortunately targeting any of those adjacent enemies with Snipe dice not gonna work, even though you could potentially jump away and become non-adjacent using Volley die. And there is another little thing that you need to know about Volley that I think is not obvious at all. So let's say for a moment that we don't have any adjacent enemies. And then again, let's say that we roll this Snipe dice alongside Volley targeting Breton Bandit. Now, if you read the wording of this Volley die specifically again, which says deal a total of 4 damage distributed as you choose among adjacent enemies, and then place yourself in an unoccupied hex. So that second part that started with then kinda implies that dealing damage is necessarily in order to then place yourself in an occupied hex, but there is actually a kinda sort of rule that is not actually in the rule book, but it says that you must resolve the abilities as fully as you can. And that means that even though you're not able to deal damage simply because you don't have any adjacent units, you still can then place yourself 2 to 4 hexes away as normal as only resolving the second part of this ability. And the same of course is true even if you're rolling just a single Volley die, even without Snipe, without even targeting at all. Provided that you don't have any adjacent enemies, you can essentially just roll and resolve this die on its own, effectively becoming kinda like an extra movement or a teleport 2 to 4 hexes. But that is of course only provided that you don't have adjacent enemies. Let's say if you have this Khajiit Cutthroat standing adjacent to you and you roll this Volley die, then you need to either resolve the full effect of this die, which means you would need to deal that damage, and in this particular case you would take 3 damage back because this enemy has a riposte 3, and only then you can place yourself 2 to 4 hexes away, or you may choose not to resolve this die entirely and just exhaust it straight away. But the point is that you cannot choose not to deal damage and then place yourself 2 to 4 hexes away, so that means you need to either resolve the full effect of dealing damage and then placing yourself, or if you don't have any adjacent enemies, then only then you can essentially kind of skip that part simply because there is no enemies to deal damage to. And I know this is a little bit confusing, but I hope it makes sense. Next, let's talk about another level 2 skill die, which is Acid Spray, which says select up to 3 targetable enemies, roll 2d6 for each, then apply a Bane status die to each enemy for whom you roll a total of 7 or higher. So let's say instead of this Breton Bandit we have Red Guard Marauder, and also our old friend Spider, and maybe this Wisp Mother. Just like with Volley, for Acid Spray you don't need to declare a target, you can simply select up to 3 targetable enemies, which means that those enemies they need to be in range and in sight. And if you manage to get this particular result, which means it's not a miss, then you would need to roll 2d6 dice against each of those enemies individually. So d6 are those dice with numbers that you use for lockpick checks, and you would need to roll 2 of them against each enemy, hoping for a result of 7 or higher. So let's say we roll this 2 die against Wisp Mother, let's see what we get, and we've got 5, which is less than 7, therefore this enemy will not gain Bane. Then let's roll the same 2 dice against Red Guard Marauder, let's see what we have, that is 4, again that means this enemy will not get Bane. And finally let's roll again against Spider, let's see what we get, and that is another result that is fewer than 7. Wow, that is extremely unlucky, but hey. Actually, statistically speaking, in order to get 7 or higher on 2 of these dice, the probability chance of that is 58%. And that of course accounts for all combinations, like for example 4 on 4, or maybe 5 and 2, or maybe 6 and 1, yeah, just all different combinations that you can have in order to get a total of 7 or higher. And again, that probability is about 58%, so the fact that I just rolled none out of 3 is statistically pretty unlucky. Nevertheless, if you do get lucky, then those enemies they would gain a Bane status die, like on each of them, just like so, and that means that at the beginning of each of their turn individually, they would start taking 1 true damage. Generally speaking, I would say that Bane is pretty helpful, especially against stalwart enemies, especially if you're playing in true solo, because remember that stalwart enemies that cannot lose more than 1 health in a single turn. So for this particular spider with 5 health, normally it would take you at least 5 turns in order to defeat this spider, but with Bane you essentially doubling that rate, because that enemy would lose first 1 health on your turn, provided that you would be dealing some damage, and then it would also lose 1 health on its own turn because of Bane. Bane also can help against ethereal enemies like this with Mother, for example, because remember that ethereal enemies they prevent damage equal to party size if you not engage them in magic battle form. So in this case, because we're using a ranged battle form, normally this enemy would prevent 1 damage, provided that we're playing solo without other adventurers, and even our Snipe dice not gonna ignore ignore this particular attack because it's not defense, it's a different, just enemy skill. And of course Bane is also pretty helpful against other enemies like shatter enemies or divert enemies or general just high defense enemies. The only caveat is that you need to be pretty lucky with your rolls in order to get the maximum value out of this particular skill die, which is, as I said, statistically speaking, just roughly about 58% of landing the 7 or higher. Though of course sometimes you just get completely unlucky, just like you saw a moment ago when I tried to roll 3 times against those enemies, landing none of those 3. Moving on to the level 3, the first die we have here is Vinedusk Training, which says at the start of your turn, you may exhaust this die to recover up to 2 bow skill dice or up to 3 if they are all snipe dice. So first of all, it's an active die, which is indicated by the letter A next to its description, which means that after rolling and resolving this die, it goes to your active slot and sitting there just like so. And I think the most important part of this die in its timing, which says at the start of your turn. Now, if we have a look at the basic combat skill dice reference sheet, and on its other side we have adventure turn reference and the turn breakdown, and as you can tell, start of turn is a very specific step of turn which happens before recovery, and that is a crucial part which I think sometimes gets overlooked. So just to show you how it works, let's put a bunch of dice in our cooldown track, maybe both of these snipe dice, maybe just put all of these, and maybe even another snipe dice, and let's sprinkle with some life fatigue in between. Let's say something like that. And so let's say this is the beginning of our turn, and the common mistake that I pretty often see is that people use their recovery first, which means in this case we're gonna recover 2 dice like that, and only then they would use Vinedusk Training. But as we already established from the reference sheet, that's actually not the case, because start of turn happening before recovery, which means if we want to trigger this effect and exhaust this die and recover some dice, we need to do this before our recovery step. So in this particular case, let's say we can exhaust this die and either recover 2 any bow skill dice, for example, we can recover our Volley or acid spray, or we can recover all 3 snipe dice, and only then we would slide all the remaining skill dice to the left, and only then we would recover dice according to our cooldown value, which means in this case we would recover 1 combat dice and 1 light fatigue moved to the supply. And so as you can tell, the timing of this effect is pretty important, for better or worse I guess, but this is definitely something to be mindful about. Also keep in mind that if this die would be sitting in your active slots at the end of combat, and by the end of this combat it will get exhausted just as a normal part of the end of combat cleanup. So overall this is a pretty straightforward skill, with the only exception with its timing. Just remember that it happens before the recovery step. Moving on, next let's talk about rapid fire. On the one face it says deal 2 damage to your target for each snipe die in your cooldown track prior to this engage, and on the other face it says deal 2 damage to your target for each snipe die in your cooldown track prior to this engage, and then recover those dice, replacing them with light fatigue. So let's talk about dealing damage with this die first. It deals 2 damage for each snipe die in our cooldown track, which in this case we have 2 snipe die sitting in our cooldown track, so that would be 4 damage with this side. Keep in mind that those snipe dice, they need to be in our cooldown track prior to this engage. So just for demonstration purposes, let's recover this one, and let's say this is what we rolled, but despite the fact that we can choose the order in which we resolve these dice in a single engage, so you might be thinking that you could deal first 2 damage with the snipe dice, put them to your cooldown track, and then deal damage with rapid fire, but unfortunately that's not gonna work, because it specifically states that those dice needs to be prior to this engage. Now let's see what happens if we roll another side, which is this one. And maybe let's just, for demonstration purposes, let's see that this how our cooldown track looks like. So first with this engage we would deal 4 damage, because we have 2 snipe dice in our cooldown track and we deal 2 damage for each, but then we would recover those dice and replacing them with light fatigue. So those both snipe dice that will go back to our attribute row, ready for rolling, but then we would need to place light fatigue in all of those empty slots in our cooldown track. So those replaced light fatigue, they don't go to the far right side of your cooldown track, they are replacing with the exact spots recovered snipe dice were. But for now let's just revert this change and let's put all the snipe dice back to the cooldown track like so. Maybe let's add even this one here as well. And so when the rapid fire landing on this side, it's pretty good because you're recovering your snipe dice, which means they are ready to roll to deal some more damage again, but at the same time you're getting a bunch of light fatigue. And so as a maybe little pro tip, if you're going heavy on this rapid fire build, try to look up for this particular item, which is shoulder mounted parasol. It is an accessory which says for 1 tenacity interrupt, when you would gain any amount of light fatigue, remove 1 light fatigue from your cooldown track instead. And so let's say that we have this item and rapid fire landed with this particular result, which means we would deal 6 damage first because we have 3 snap dice sitting in our cooldown track. Then we could recover all those snap dice just like so, and normally we would need to replace them with life fatigue, but with this item we can spend 1 tenacity to not only not gain all of those 3 life fatigue, but we can also instead just remove 1. So that is a huge deal. Basically, instead of gaining 3 more light fatigue, you're removing 1. And if we get a little bit pedantic, this item says that when you would gain any amount of light fatigue, and at some point there was a question whether replacing fatigue in your cooldown track is considered to be gaining light fatigue, but luckily we have the official clarification that yes, when you are replacing dice in your cooldown track with light fatigue, that is still considered as gaining light fatigue, and therefore this item works. So now let's put all the snap dice back in a cooldown track, and if you notice, this rapid fire has a copy, which means there are 2 rapid fire dice. And so the question you might have is what happens if you roll these 2 copies of rapid fire together? Well, let's say if we have this result, and maybe at first let's put this result on this side as well. So let's say if we have these 2 identical sides. In this particular case, each of these dice deals 6 damage because we have 3 snap dice in our cooldown track, so this engage would deal 12 damage. Now what happens if you have this result, which means these 2 are different? One deals damage and recover dice, and another one just deals damage. Well, remember that because we can choose the order in which we resolve die, we can resolve this one first, which means it would just deal 6 damage as normal, and this one would also deal 6 damage and then recover die. So after this engage, we would deal 12 damage, and we would end up with all of our dice sitting in our attribute row with 3 light fatigue instead. But now let's see what happens if we have both of the same results just like that, and of course let's say that our snap dice still sitting in the cooldown track. And well, in this particular case, only one of those dice can deal 6 damage, because as soon as we resolve the first die, we would need to recover the dice like that, of course replacing them with life fatigue. But for the second die, by this time we already have no snap dice in our cooldown track, so it would deal no damage. And so for this reason I would say it's a little bit tricky to train both of these rapid fire dice. Of course it's only 1 out of 6 chances to land on this particular side, so I would say it's pretty rare for both of them to land on this side. So potentially if you want to maximize the damage and gain the maximum out of your rapid fire, you could potentially train both of them and even train 4 snap dice, because remember that there are 4 of them in total. But just be mindful that if you would happen to have this result particular, that only one of them can deal damage. Moving on, next we have Arrow Barrage, which says deal 2 damage to your target, then choose to either roll Arrow Barrage again or exhaust it, and on the other face it says you must resolve this result. You are dealt 2 true damage unless you drain all skill dice rolled during this engage. And so this die is essentially gambling, because if you rolled this particular side, you can choose to roll it again if you want to, and every time you roll it, the damage stacks up. So this is, let's say, 2 damage, then we roll it again, and this is another 2 damage, so that would be 4 already. That is 6 already, but eventually it will land on this side, and you won't be able to choose not to resolve this die because it says you must resolve this result. And in this case, you either dealt 2 true damage, or you drain skill dice rolled during this engage, which in this case is just this one. It will be drained and not available for the rest of the combat. But with this particular result, there is one caveat. Even though it says that you must resolve this result, remember that all abilities that affect re-rolling the die can still be applied here. So if you happen to have any abilities or effects that would allow you to re-roll the die, you can still do that even though it says you must resolve this result. And as a matter of fact, I've made a whole build around this particular side and this particular trick with my Bard crazy rerolling build. And in case you haven't watched that yet, I'll put a link in the description because it's hilariously overpowered. But of course, if you don't have any rerolling abilities, it means you would need to either drain this die or take 2 true damage. And of course, if you choose to drain this die, it would apply to all dice rolled in a single engage. So let's say if you also rolled 2 snipe dice alongside this as a single engage and you eventually get this result, that means you would need to either take true damage or drain all of them, which means they won't be available for the rest of the battle. And if we look at the number of phases that this die has, there are 4 sides of this one dealing damage and potentially rolling this again, 1 broken arrow, which means you must resolve this result, and 1 miss. So statistically speaking, it's actually not that strong. I even asked ChatGPT about the average damage you can get with this die by default, and the answer is roughly 4 damage. But nevertheless, I think it's still pretty fun to kind of betting and gambling and potentially seeing if you want to deal more or more damage. And let's see if we get, yep, that's 2 damage and another 2 damage and another 2 damage, so that was 6 already, and that is another 2 damage, look at that. And another 2 damage, so even though it's statistically speaking only 4 damage, this can get still sometimes just out of control. This is another 2 damage, and another 2 damage, and another 2 damage. I'm not sure if it's actually rolling here on this surface. But yeah, this is what you eventually will get. So definitely a pretty fun skill and even can be used as a whole build on its own. And finally, onto level 4, we have a single die called Scatter Shot. All damage dealt to your target this engage may also be dealt to another targetable enemy. Defense ignored as a result of Snipe dice may also be ignored for this enemy. And so while this die doesn't deal damage on its own, it effectively doubles the damage of our engage. And let's say maybe instead of this spider we have this Khajiit Cutthroat again, and let's say that we're rolling this Scatter Shot alongside 3 Snipe dice targeting this Khajiit Cutthroat, and this is the result that we get. That would be 3 damage, and because we have Snipe dice that ignore defense, that means that the Khajiit Cutthroat would actually take 3 damage, and because we also have Scatter Shot, we can select another targetable enemy, and remember that targetable simply means that in range and in sight, so we can choose either of those enemies as our second target to deal the same 3 damage and also ignore the same 3 defense. And also because with Scatter Shot we're not actually targeting the second enemy, we're simply selecting a targetable enemy, which is quite different from declaring a target. That means we're not actually engaging that enemy, and therefore some enemy skills that trigger only after being engaged is not gonna work. For example, if we choose this Red Guard Marauder as the second target with Scatter Shot, its Shatter effect not gonna work against us. So potentially, if you want to get absolute maximum value out of Scatter Shot, deal the most amount of damage to up to 2 enemies, and for that you would need to have all of those Snipe dice sitting in your cooldown track, and you would need to have both of this rapid fire rolled like that. That would be 12 damage because we have 3 Snipe dice sitting in our cooldown track dealt to 2 enemies, so that is potentially up to 24 damage dealt in a single engage. With the odd exception that perhaps with Arrow Barrage you could deal even more damage if you get pretty lucky with this roll, and especially if you have some kind of re-rolling engine like I've mentioned in my bot build that can deal potentially even more damage, but in pretty normal circumstances without all of this crazy re-rolling shenanigans, if you just want to deal nice and consistent steady amount of damage, this is probably the most that you can get. And of course, having just those 6 dice, if we put them on in the attribute row, just like that, you might notice that a level 2 skill die is missing, and if you are new to the game, you might be wondering if it's actually possible to train just like that without kind of skipping a level 2 skill die, and the answer is yes, it is possible. Let's say maybe instead of this Snipe die, let's say we trained our Volley first, then we trained a level 3 skill die, and then we can untrain this one, of course sliding all the remaining skill dice like that, and then we can train another level 3 and even 4, and even pretty much any level we can train up to from that point. So yes, it is legal. So what's kind of my final thoughts about this bow skill line as a whole? First of all, I would say it's pretty average when it comes to pure raw damage output. For comparison, I think two-handed skill line is definitely capable of doing more burst damage. Destruction staff potentially can deal high burst damage, and potentially even one-handed shield is still capable of doing more damage in a single engage compared to bow. That being said, the average damage output is highly compensated by defense ignoring effect, by dealing damage to multiple enemies, provided that you have trained Scatter Shot, which I think you definitely should. I think this skill is absolute must-have regardless of what other skills you're training from this skill line, and of course by the fact that you are dealing damage from range. Generally speaking, ranged characters have a lot of advantages compared to melee characters, especially once you train your stamina up to 5 or even sometimes 6. You can deal damage far away, staying completely safe from all these melee units. I also think there is quite a decent amount of variety in this skill line. For example, you can train Vinedusk training, which makes this whole skill line even more reliable, maybe not as high bursty but still quite consistent, which helps this kind of whole recovery engine going even more smoothly. You can also train Volley, which helps with mobility and dealing damage to adjacent enemies, which sometimes helps a lot, especially if you are playing solo. And by the way, speaking of being a ranged character, the very first advancement I would suggest you to train is not even actually a skill but a stat to train up to 4th stamina. So this is the very first upgrade I would recommend you to do. Let's just remove those enemies for example, and let's say we have this a single Red Guard Marauder. With a range of 3, the enemy can still move 2 hexes closer and attack us the same turn, but as soon as we train up to 4 stamina, that means there would be 3 hexes difference now between the two, so this is a big break point where you can start potentially dealing damage to some enemies while they still cannot reach you in a single turn, which is a huge deal. So overall, I really like the bow skill line. I think it's pretty flexible, I think it's pretty fun, especially with some crazy shenanigans you can do with Arrow Barrage and steady damage and recovery dice. Yeah, just thumbs up. I think it's a great skill line, it's very thematic. Yeah, I like it. And that's it for this breakdown. If you found it helpful, feel free to give it a like and subscribe, this really helps the channel grow. And if you would like to support what I'm doing more directly, you can do this over on Patreon, and I would appreciate this a lot as well. And well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.